Welcome! Today we are changing a timing belt and water pump using a complete installation kit. Comes with tensioners and idler pulley. This particular model, 289,000 miles. Reason for replacement is noise, essentially. On this particular vehicle, we're going to make sure that the ignition is off. It is not pushed to start, so we'll just keep the key in the off position, and we'll keep the key with us at our tool. We have a hybrid Synergy drive. We are currently looking at a 3.3 liter. So you can see timing belt was last done at, let's see if we can read their sticker here. I can't really read it. I believe it says 56,000 miles in 2011. The reason for changing is because we have some noise coming from the front of the engine, which we believe to be one of the tensioner pulleys or idler pulleys. So we're going to get going on this. We'll try to set up a camera and try to get the best angles that we can. What we'll be using is a Gates kit. And this particular kit is going to come with our timing belt, which I had already taken out. Kind of peeked at the kit prior to using it. Here we have our tensioner. What I always like to do is take my tensioner out first and make sure that it is sitting upright in the box, or if it's not in the box, sitting upright, so that way any air that's in there can go to where it needs to go. You can see the kit comes with a nice premium metal and O-ring type of gasket. We have our idler pulley as well as our tensioner pulley that comes with the kit, which is our main concern at this point, so let's make sure we have that. And we also have a water pump. What I like to do is I like to keep these parts trays as well too. The reason why I keep the parts tray, well, I call it a parts tray, but I make parts tray out of them, and I use them. As you can see, we do them pretty regularly. So we'll try to set this camera up and we'll get going on the installation of these components. Now, this hybrid model will have things in the way typically that the typical 3.3 liter in a Toyota doesn't have, like our brake master cylinder that's over here. This usually isn't in this location, but it's not necessarily in our way. What we are going to move though is we're going to move our battery, disconnect it, and we're also just going to move this off to the side in just a moment. And as I get deeper into here, I'll try to get the best camera angles that I can so you can kind of see what's going on. But as for now, we'll go ahead and start removing some of this stuff, and we'll kind of time lapse this until we get into the actual removal and installation of the timing belt and water pump. So now we're going to focus on a couple of things. We need to get the timing cover off, but the timing cover on the timing cover is this wiring harness. This wiring harness runs along the whole top of it, and it kind of gets in the way of actually getting the timing cover off. And these are simply held on by little push clips, and I'll show you how those come off in a second. Almost every one right here, you just push this clip up or to the side per se, and then these clips will usually just slide right up off of the tab, and you can see there's just a little piece that it hangs onto. So you just want to follow all these around and pull them up. And this will be a little bit difficult to get this pull harness side off. But what I'll usually do is stick a little bungee cord and kind of pull it up out of the way, and you'll see that in a moment. Disconnecting a couple of grounds. Just a quick connect, pull them apart, and then just go off to the side. So, try to poke in here, and then we'll start pulling this. So, we're going to push these little tabs up, get this harness up out of the way here, so that we can get our timing cover on, or off per se. So, obviously, you don't want to put too much tension on this harness. I mean, it is all important wires. You don't want to be putting gorilla strength on it up. The goal is to just get it out of your way a little bit, just so you can work around it. So we'll find somewhere to get our bungee hooked up to here, somewhere where it's not going to damage anything. And there you have it. Let's see if we can get a better close-up now. The harness here is disconnected from the tabs all the way back. We have our bungee up around it so that we can access all of our timing cover bolts all the way to the back. It is tight in here, but it's really not that bad, trust me. It looks a lot worse than what it is. So we'll keep going. Now you can see, with the timing cover removed, there is this bolt right here. There's 6 bolts that I had taken off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This actually slides down on one, and we'll get a closer up shot of that. That should have been removed too. Luckily it didn't break when I did pull it up. Just kind of gave it a little wiggle and it did pop up from where it was kind of tabbed into. We'll touch base on that after as far as order of operation and what should be installed first or second. But bottom cover goes in first. I think I just forgot to take that bolt out, but like I said, luckily I didn't break it. But here we have upper cover removed. You see, it's really not that bad. The most difficult bolt is in the backside of the head, or the cover, that is a little bit difficult to get to. You probably see me on the time lapse trying to get an air tool in there. Air tools are not required, and the lift isn't required, but obviously makes life easier. So we're going to raise this. We're going to take our crank pulley off, take our lower cover off, but prior to that, I think we may loosen these top 2 bolts. We'll see what happens, but we'll pick it up and take a look at the bottom, and we'll take a peek down there and see what we got to take off in order to gain access to the bottom cover. Splash shield that requires removal. Trying to stay out of the way. A little difficult. Some may still have that clip still installed. This one's already been removed. There's just 2 bolts. It comes off. And we'll get a closer view of what's going on. Boom, crank bolt. Working. Short socket. So, typically, you don't have to use this to take the crank pulley off, but this is what we're going to have to use this time. It's a 3/4 gun. There's many ways you can do it. I just happen to have this, so I'm going to use it to take the crank bolt off because it's on there pretty damn good. There we go. Jesus. Fuck, I was on there. So, I don't know how, there's many different ways you can get a frozen bolt off. I just happen to have a 3/4 inch impact gun in the shop, so got it out. With this particular crank pulley, there is 2 8x125 holes we're going to tap on here, or not tap, but put bolts in with a puller, and we're going to pull this pulley off. Sometimes you can get lucky and they'll walk off. They're not really technically pressed on very tight, but as you can see, the bolt was pretty damn tight, so I would imagine this is probably stuck on here good too, so we're not even going to bother trying to pry it off. We're just going to go ahead and get a puller on here and use a puller to get it off. Alright, so with the crank pulley removed, we'll see if we can get a good shot here. What we're going to want to do is remove these cover bolts. That one, there is that one, and you can see, I believe that that one was the one that we had forgotten to take off prior to the top cover removal, and the top cover needs to be installed first, I believe. We'll figure out the exact order, I can't recall. What we're going to do is we're going to take these cover bolts off, and we're also going to take these bottom bolts off of the mount. So we're going to remove this cover, those two bottom motor mount bolts, and motor mount bracket bolts, and then we'll show you what it looks like after that. Alright, there's our bottom cover. You can see now we have the nut off of here. You also need to remove this stud, loosen it so that it moves freely and it's out. It will not come out until the mount is out. This bolt is also loose. We have our cover loose or out, and you can tell it's a good thing we did this because you can see the bottom of the water pump up there is leaking coolant. There's captured coolant all coming down the front of the block. So the water pump might actually be the culprit that's making the noise in this particular vehicle. What we also need to do is remove this and pay attention to its orientation. I'm not sure if you can see it on the camera, but it's not perfectly flat. This side has like a flat edge. This side is like slightly rounded. The slightly rounded side should go towards the belt. And also you'll see the pattern of the cog teeth that have kind of worn onto it, whereas this side it doesn't have the pattern of the cog teeth. So just pay attention to which way it goes. It has to go back on the same way, and you need to make sure that it goes on prior to the cover being put on when we put this back together as well too. And as you can see, what we're doing over here is using our pass trays to organize all our bolts, all our nuts, keeping our brackets and covers organized while we do this so that everything goes back in the correct place and we don't forget anything. So now we're going to lower the vehicle, we'll go up top and get ready to remove this mount so that we can have access to all these parts and also the water pump to change it. Are lowered, we're going to remove the top two motor mount bolts, and we're going to get this motor mount out of here so that we have access to everything in here. I have had instances where those studs, the end of them is a Torx on the stud where you take the nut off for the mount. It is a female Torx, which is a E as in Edward, E8. I've had instances where they've been stuck in there and they break off, and you really have no choice but to use a stud extractor to try to get it out. And I have had luck with that. Stud extractor, get them out, and then you have to repair the threads or find a new stud that length or a bolt to replace it with. So we'll keep going. We are during regular shop hours now, so some music going in the background. Might not be the best choice for everyone, but we just play music that everybody can kind of like. Although Fred Durst isn't really anybody's favorite. Nobody has time to go press thumbs down on the radio all the time, right?
Yeah, so this is possible without a lift. Makes life a lot easier with a lift. You can go up and down much faster. You don't have to lay on the ground. One day this bolt will be out.
And there we have it. Just got to get that stud now. Hopefully it comes out. Oh yeah, butter. Studs technically should be finger tight. The stud shouldn't be really tightened. Even when you put it back in, it should be pretty much finger tight in there. But I'll use a ratchet, run it down, you know, just kind of lightly snug it. You don't need to tighten the crap out of it. I should be able to get that by hand. Now we can kind of move the mount, and if you wiggle the mount in certain directions, move it, you'll be able to get a couple bolts out. Just remember your orientation of your studs and where which stud goes where. And we'll get stud out, bolt out, and do the same on the bottom. Kind of move it around different positions so you can turn it enough for to make adequate room to get the stud out. And also the bolt on the bottom. And I dropped one, but no biggie, I'll pick it up. And it'll take it's like one of those Chinese puzzles where it really only comes out one way. You gotta figure out how it does, and voila, we got the mount out. And we'll keep our studs and our bolts with it in the proper orientation. I suppose the stud orientation isn't too important on the hybrid because it doesn't use the studs for any bracketry really. It's only to hold the mount. But on the models that are not hybrid, the front stud is used for one of the support brackets on the alternator. Again, this is a hybrid, so it's a little different. So now we're going to be turning our motor over by that crank bolt to line up our timing marks. We need to line up the crank and also both cams. I will usually line up the crank and see if the cams are lined up. If they are not, then you need to rotate one more time in order to get the cams in the correct location. So what I'll usually do is rotate it. You can see the camshaft top timing mark, and which I will show you in just a moment. Oh, I actually just passed it. I missed it. So we'll go around again. And where are you? There it is. Surprisingly, wow, I've actually never had that happen before. So typically when you first install these timing belts, they have lines on them to mark everything, and it's almost impossible to ever get them to line up again after you rotate the engine. See, well, maybe you can't see that well. Let me get a light. There's a line on the belt that lines up with that little line on the camshaft pulley, and that lines up with the mark on the cover. There's a similar line on the other side. Typically these lines are lined up when you first install the belt, and it's actually very rare that they'll ever line up again like they are now. So I think it's kind of cool that they've lined up just like they are now. I've never had that happen. So here we have this mark lined up. We can assume our back is lined up. This vehicle came in running just fine, no running issues, no mill on. It was simply because of noise, which I believe may be coming from an idler or a water pump. We'll take a look at our bottom mark. And you can see a little dot, and we'll clean off the little mark that's above it where it should be aligned. And when we install this, there'll also be a little dot there to the right, and there's a dotted line on the belt that helps us line that up as well too. So as of now, we're pretty well lined up. I'm going to clean off some of this coolant so I can ensure our bottom is lined up, and we'll start taking some pulleys off a little bit. And you can see that this dot right here from this tooth is lined up with this little notch on the bottom. This is our crank timing mark. And up here we have our lines all lined up here. And we can assume, like I said, the rear is lined up. We had no running issues, and now they manufacture belts with these lines, so it's not as difficult to get this rear lined up. Prior to this, you really had to be have some good eyes and maybe even use a mirror to try to get this to line up on the back side with the cover. So we'll start taking some pulleys off. All right, so I like starting with this one. I'm going to take this pulley off, and then we'll be able to get our belt off and get the rest of this stuff off. All the idlers, or the idler and the tensioner pulley, is going to be a 14 millimeter. Or I'm sorry, the idler is a 14, and down here is going to be a hex on the tensioner, which I believe is a 10. I'll get to that in a moment. And just as a note, this is not a factory belt. I know the cover had said 56K. Likely, you know, at 56, it was probably done at the dealer. It was a dealer sticker. The particular belt that's on here is a Gates belt. I can only assume that it's more than likely a aftermarket setup, which isn't a bad thing. Gates makes good products. All right. So, Kind of felt like we did have a little bit of movement in the cams, but it's not to worry. As long as we're not cranking the engine over or doing anything crazy, we can always line everything up. It won't be no big deal. So now we can take our belt off. Yeah, our back cam moved a little bit, but we can always turn that back clockwise where it needs to be. So we got our belt out now. What we'll do now is take the tensioner pulley off. This particular tensioner pulley is a 10mm hex, and it's on the bottom side. The bolt actually acts as the pivot point slash bushing that the tensioner actually, pivots on as it runs. Let me see. Can you see down there? It's a little bit hard for you to see down there, huh? But if you're getting in there, you'll see it. You'll know what I'm talking about. I'll show you the pulley as soon as I pull it up. So you can see now we got the tensioner out, and this is actually the pivot point. The bolt is the pivot point. It's like a bushing, and looks like somebody had lubed it. I mean, whoever did it last at least gave a shit. They were doing what they were supposed to. So we'll take this out, set it to the side. We'll just keep the bolt with it so we don't lose the bolt. We'll set it up with our rest of our parts, and now we need to get our tensioner out, which is at the very bottom where the tensioner pulley actually rode on. And those are 12mm bolts, I believe. All right, let's take this off. One bolt. Take that before it falls into the abyss. And get our next bolt. And this is actually nice because with the non-hybrid models, the power steering pump gets in the way of this. And you can get the tensioner out without removing the power steering pump. You just need to go up with it, down with it, and to gain access with the bolts to the bolts. But we got the tensioner out, no power steering pump, a little bit easier. So now what we'll do is we're going to get a pan under the vehicle because we're about to take the water pump out. Once we get the water pump out, it's obviously going to make a mess. And actually, there is some play to it, and it is the culprit. The water pump is the culprit. I'm sure you may not be able to hear it on the camera, but you spin this and it's loud. It basically sounds like a bad bearing. You spin it, brah, brah, that growly sound. So our water pump definitely is the culprit here. We're lucky we're changing it and it hadn't failed completely. We'll grab our coolant bucket, put it underneath, and we'll start taking this water pump out. And there is a couple things that we need to pay attention to here when we're taking the water pump out and putting it in. The water pump is actually slightly behind this cover. So this cover, what I usually like to do is take two of these cover bolts, the rear cover bolts out, and kind of put like a screwdriver where the top idler would be behind it to pull the cover out slightly, but not necessarily bend it. That allows us to get the pump out and walk it out without physically removing any cam gears in order to get it in and out. I'm not sure what service information says, but without pulling this cover back a little bit, this pump will not come out because of the ridge that sits behind the cover. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a moment. All right, we got our coolant bucket now. I did want to kind of touch base with the tensioner again. This washer did fall down from it. It is important. It goes behind on the back side of it where it mounts to the engine. This washer goes on the back side. So if you drop this, make sure you get it because you will need it for proper installation. I suppose I'm just going to lower the car, but I think we'll be fine where we're at. Let's get to work. So here's what we're going to do. I dropped the bolt. We'll retrieve that in just a moment. We're going to take these two cover bolts out. Get a better angle of what's going on here. So here's our pump. We removed that bolt on the cover, and then this is where the idler was, and then we removed, give me 1 second, this bolt down here. And what we're going to do is stick something behind here to pull this cover out a little bit and remove our water pump bolts. All right, this is where we're at. All right, we're going to take this pry bar and we're going to set it up behind here, just so that we can pry on it a little once we want to get the water pump out. Let's set our camera up and we'll begin on water pump removal. So apparently I didn't hit record, but I got the water pump off. Took the bolts off, pump comes off, coolant spills out. You get the gist. We have a total of 3 bolts and 3 nuts that holds this on. Took those off, and our water pump. Our water pump in here came out. Water pump is removed. I would have liked to get the splash of coolant, but unfortunately I forgot to press record. So what we're going to do now is basically clean up all our gasket surfaces and get this ready to install our new pump. We've got it cleaned up. Ideally, for cleaning, you do want to use just a Scotch Brite pad. You don't want to remove really any metal. You just want to take the old gasket surfaces off. If you've been doing it a long time, you can use the power angle grinder. This is a very, very, very soft disc, which isn't going to remove the aluminum, and simply it's just to remove some of that gasket material a little bit faster when you're working with time. You just want to make sure you're not making the surface where it makes uneven. You want to remove the gasket, not metal material. So right now we have our gasket surface cleaned. Although you can't see the gasket surface, we'll show you in a moment. We got it all cleaned up, and we'll be putting the pump on in a minute. And this is what it's going to look like. Pump is out. There's the 3 studs, and then there's 3 bolts that hold it in. We'll be torquing it down in a moment, and you'll see me install it. Now, the pump does have, the block. The block will have dowels that will hold the gasket in place, and you can actually slide the gasket where it needs to be, and there's small dowels that hold it in place, as you can see there. The gasket's in place, the dowels are holding it. Here's our pump, and we'll walk it up. Have to be patient.
In order to get this to come up correctly, you also need to pull back on that cover a little bit like we mentioned earlier. You'll find usually it comes out a lot easier than it goes in.
And there you have it. Pump's on. Move this out of the way. Get some of our bolts started. And then we'll grab a torque wrench and get them torqued up. You're going to want to consult your service information to see exactly what your torque specs are going to be. This particular one, I'm going to torque to 90 to 100 inch pounds. We're just going to run them down finger tight. And now we'll install our tensioner. I like to install the idler last. That allows me to get my timing marks set properly, and then I put this pulley in last on this particular engine. Before we do that though, we're just going to kind of spray this down with some brake clean, get rid of all the coolant and all the pulleys, and kind of clean it up in here. Give it a quick beege. cleaned off. I like to give my water pump a nice little turn, make sure there's no binding, make sure everything's working correctly. And then we'll get our tensioner installed on the bottom there. So like we talked about before, we put a little bit of just a light oil. What I use is just a Marvel Mystery Oil on this particular bushing here, just to keep it from rusting or galling. And then that washer that we spoke about goes on the back side, and that goes down there. But what I almost forgot. I know I said I was installing the tensioner next, but actually not the tensioner pulley. But what we need to install first is the tensioner. Tensioner is going to go in. We're going to bolt it in and leave the pin in. This pin only gets pulled when everything is set, all your timing marks are on, everything is installed, and you're ensured everything is where it's supposed to be. Then this pin gets pulled. We're going to go ahead and install this where it goes down here. This particular one has a shorter bolt and a longer bolt. You can't really mix them up on this one. The shorter and longer bolts only really go in one location, and you'll know if it's in the wrong spot. Shorter bolt on top, longer bolt on bottom. We'll get them started with our hands, make sure our threads are started, and then we'll run it down. And of course you never want to really assume that it's tight, so we're just going to double check, make sure we're tight. Next up will be our tensioner, which we've lubricated the pivot point in here, the shiny point that goes in the bushing. We've lubricated it. I've used Marvel Mystery Oil. That's what I always seem to use if I can't find that. You know, just put a little engine oil on it. Not too much, obviously. You don't want an excessive amount slinging everywhere. And this washer that we discussed, that goes on the back side of it. Also, what I like to do too is put a little bit of grease, a small little dab of grease, just right on that pivot point where the bottom, there's a little roller on the tensioner that contacts the tip. I'm sorry, a roller on the tensioner pulley that contacts the tip of the tensioner. I like to put a little bit of oil on there too, so it's not galling, moves nice and freely. I'm sure with another cameraman this would probably come out a little bit better of a video, but and what we'll do is snug this up nice and tight, and then verify that it moves freely. This has to move freely in order to keep tension on your belt. So we have nice free movement, everything's tight. Now we can move on to making sure our alignment marks are lined up and we can get our belt on. So we know that our back pulley moves. What we're going to do now is try to move that back pulley forward to where it needs to be. You want to turn it clockwise on my particular situation because it's sprung backwards. There will be no damage, no piston or valve damage if it has sprung backwards like it has. It's happened to me many a times. What we're going to do is just rotate this back cam forward so that our mark lines up somewhere close so that we can get everything back together. 17 millimeter. All right, let's rotate this a little. Be careful because it is going to be under some spring pressure. And we're just going to bring it forward enough so that it's relatively close to its timing mark and it's not going to spring. And we'll check our front one. Our front one appears to be fairly lined up. If I had a paint marker, I'd mark them up so you could see them better, but at this point I don't have one. Now we're going to get our belt situated so that our bottom mark is lined up, two top marks are lined up, and we're in the water pump and tensioner pulley. And then lastly, we will put this top tensioner pulley in to wrap up that section. I want to show you the dotted lines on this particular belt and also the arrows on this particular belt. The arrows are going to face outwards. So the belt's going to be installed like this, and our dotted line is going to go on our indicator, a dot on the crank pulley, which I will show you after. We're going to go ahead and go down and do that, and then we'll come up and line our top lines up with the cam pulleys. So take your time, be patient, try to get everything to line up. You know, it's gonna take you a few tries. It's a lot easier, you know, if you can do this at home with somebody else. But myself, I'm stubborn, you know, I'm not gonna ask anybody for help. I'm gonna do it myself. I'm sure a lot of you can relate.
Alright, we need to go water pump to that cam. And boom. Check our bottom mark. Now what I do like to do sometimes, I already have this set up here. I like to put something on here to keep this from coming off. Now that I have this mark lined up and I verified that bottom dots are lined up, I'll show you.
Now, if any of you have ever read the instructions on a timing belt, they tell you don't pry, don't crimp, don't do anything to this belt to cause damage. What I'm actually using is a pair of very soft, they're rounded over, they're made for welding. But this particular, I mean, there's no sharp edges on this, and I'm not going to clamp the hell out of this. What I'm going to do is just very, 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 very softly just set these on here so that my belt doesn't come walking off of this when I try to put pressure on the other side. The bottom side should stay, and now I can try to get my back side to line up with my line. This allows you to do it by yourself and be dependent on nobody but your own knowledge. Like I said, you don't want to be prying, you don't want to be trying to force this belt anywhere it's not supposed to be. But if you can put those there, hold it, keep it from coming off, there's no reason why you can't. You just need to be gentle. Don't mar it, don't clamp it and crap out of it, just very easy. And what we'll do is we'll line that back line up, try to get this belt on here.
Hey, you want any maxi pads?
Oh, you know what that is? That's more of those fucking things. Yeah.
Yeah, that fucking little smart car, an alternator.
Yeah. Yeah, easy.
How much you put the jack up and lower down a little bit.
Cake.
Right now.
That's awesome. And of course, he distracted me and my belt popped off. All right, let's try this again. My cam pulley actually moved too, so we had to bring the cam pulley back. Try this one more time. All right, looks like I've got my line there. And it looks like my belt actually came off the bottom. So let's fix that first. As you can see, there's no magic of TV here. I might edit some of it out so you're not watching me for a half hour trying to get the damn thing lined up. But as you can see, you know, not to toot my own horn, but I'm a master tech, and it takes patience. You gotta be patient, get the belt on, and take your time because you don't want to take this back apart. What I find myself doing sometimes too is keeping the wrench on the pulley to try to get the line lined up and kind of rotating back and forth. You can get that feeling, you know, you're not going to hit any valves on this particular engine as long as you're not cranking it over a full revolution. You can move the cam back a tiny bit. I'm going to try to do it without doing that, but we'll see. Here's what we're going to try to do on this one. Rotate. we gotta figure something out here because this one's kicking my ass. Alright, let's try it this way without rotating the actual entire belt. Try to keep just skipping a tooth. Almost had it. All right. So, I believe now we got everything all set. If I'm lucky, I've got my bottom mark lined up, but as of now, both of my top marks are lined up, and we're gonna get our pulley started so we can check our bottom mark and see where we're at, see if we need to adjust anything. I guess I'll see how long it took me. Of course, I was on camera, so it took me longer. Alright, that's there now, so we're going to check our bottom mark. And we can remove this. And again, I mean, you can see how loose I have these. I mean, it won't take very much to take them off, and there's no mark, no marring. Very gentle. Alright, excellent. I've checked our bottom mark, and we're actually on point. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten this. And I'm going to pull our pin. And just for the sake of having marks lined up, we're gonna Alright, so all our marks are where they're supposed to be. And what we're going to do is I'm going to show you exactly what everything looks like, all of our marks. First of all, we'll show you the crank mark. You can see, as soon as it focuses, the dot and also the dotted line there where it marks, you know, so you can see our timing mark if I can get it to focus. Come on. That dot lines up with the dot we had with the mark on the cover that we discussed before. The angle of the camera makes it look a little off, but right where it needs to be. Our top mark is lined up with the valve cover. I'm sorry, the rear timing cover, and also the mark on the cam. There's a small mark on the cam. In our rear, let's see if we can see it. As you can see, having this line on here is very, very, very helpful to us because our line now is lined up with the line on the cam. I don't know how well you can see it, but when I look at it, it is perfectly lined up with the line on the cam, and it does line up with the mark on the back of the cover. But having this line on the belt is a huge time saver. There's really no guesswork. As long as you're lined up with the line on the cam, 2 cams in the crank, you don't have to focus too much on what's on the back cover. We know we're in time now. We've pulled our pin from our tensioner out, and now we're just going to double check our fasteners and we'll start reassembling. So let's slide this puppy in here. And do the same thing that we did before to get it out. Kind of walk it around and get our studs installed and our bolts installed in whatever order. And there she is. Start them by hand a little bit. That's reverse.
Alright, we'll just do these by hand.
Alright, so our top timing cover is going to go on first, and we have buttoned up everything up here, so I'm going to go ahead and put this top timing cover on. Tight squeeze, but it will fit, I promise. And voila! We'll get our top cover on, and we'll pick it up and we'll get our bottom cover on. You can kind of see where we're at. There's that top cover, the two holes that need to be there first. And we're going to go ahead and tighten these two bottom bolts. And also we need to take this back off, our bolt, and get our little washer back on there before the bottom cover goes back on. Pop this off. And remember what we discussed about this? Geared side, where you can see the teeth. Just gonna go timing belt side, keep it from getting marred up. And that is gonna be keyed. It will only fit in one spot. And we can put our cover on. So I guess as you see in the beginning of the video where I took the top cover off first, technically you should be taking the bottom cover off first. Bottom cover should come off first, and then the top cover can come off. So you don't cause any damage, don't break anything. I was lucky enough to not break anything.
Snug that stuff. Tighten the bolts. Yo, B! You know what coil to put in? Yeah. Yeah. Just making sure. Awesome. Yo, tighten these up.
There you have it. Those two bolts in, the two bottom bolts are tight, our timing cover bolts are tight. Now we can put our crank pulley. I just put a little lubrication on the inside of the crank pulley just to allow it to go on a little bit smoother. And it is keyed, it is only going to go on one way. You should not have to hammer this on. But what I do like to do is just give it a couple little taps. And you see, because it's lubricated, it slides right on. I didn't hit it hard. Light taps with the soft end of a hammer, slides right on. If it does not, you may have to clean out a little bit of the inside of there if there's an excessive amount of corrosion. But it slid on fairly easy. And then it's time for our crank bolts. And I don't ever want it to fall off, and I figure it's better tight and not coming off, as in having some Loctite on it rather than being a little loose. So I put some Loctite on it. I send it home with an impact gun. It's a pretty good sized bolt, 14 or 16 millimeter or something like that, maybe even a 17 mil bolt. And we'll just send that home with the impact gun, give it a nice few impacts, and it ain't gonna go anywhere. Put our little plastic shield back up. And we're back here. What we're going to do is finish this buttoning up, tightening all our timing cover bolts. Now that we have all the bottom ones tight and all these are already installed, so we know everything's going to line up. All right, now that I've ripped my gloves, now we can get our bracket back in. And what you can do is put a little bit of anti-seize in here so that the next guy doesn't have to rip it out like I did. We'll get that down into place. And we'll get our motor mount, which we've stored up here. Before we do that, let's not forget to hook up our grounds that we unplugged, which plug in like so. And also we need to get our bungee cord off of here and get our harness located back in its proper holding tabs. So we'll take our bungee off of it now. We don't need it. Move our bungee out of the way. And we'll get our harness back into its holding tabs. And actually, now that I look at it, these are supposed to go over the harness, so you actually have to unplug these and run them over the harness, not under the harness. I'm not sure if it's the same on the non-hybrid, but this particular one, that appears how they need to go. Connect. Connect. Our harness is connected. Our grounds are connected. Now, let's get our motor mount. That in place. Awesome.
Got the bolt that holds that cover down on that for the motor. There's nothing there.
Get all our brackets in place. I like to start all the bolts prior. You don't want to just tighten tighten them down. You won't be able to get the other ones in. Install our those. We'll get our long bolts in here. Get them all finger tight, or finger started by hand, I should say. You don't want to cross thread these. They're going into aluminum. Most of them. Well, 3 of them. And 3 of them are, actually 4. 4 are going into aluminum. All right. All right, so all right. Torque strut / motor mount, whatever you want to call it. That's installed. We'll bring our brake fluid reservoir back here. And we'll get ready to get this guy back in its original place. Probably help if I had the bracket, huh? This is the bracket that holds it. I just have to figure out, there we go. That looks about right. Oh yeah. Let's get our bolts. All right, let's see. We got this bolt. And this bolt. Let's see, those mount there. Okay. Just like putting the puzzle back together. Come on. And we can put this on. Whoa. Whoops. Making more of a mess here. Alright, before we bolt this down, we'll get this hose situated so we don't make any more of a mess than we need to. There we are. Get our clamp back on there. Get these bolts in there. Beautiful. Now, don't want to forget to plug this in. Our fluid level sensor. And now we'll get our battery reinstalled. The brake master cylinder, reservoir installed. We've got the battery in. We're going to put in our J-hook and battery support. I guess we'll see what we missed when we actually look at the video when the battery died on the phone. So we're going to have to keep you plugged in while we do the vacuum bleeding of the coolant system. You can fill the system manually, but what I like to use is a vacuum bleeder.
Wait, I'm fucked under that.
Essentially what this is doing is using compressed air past the venturi to suck the cooling system down into a vacuum. We're going to leave it sucked down into a vacuum while we put away tools, and that's going to allow the system to be under an extreme vacuum, at which point we will stop the air and introduce coolant to the other side of it, which will then suck the coolant in and eliminate any air bubbles in the system, eliminating the need to run the vehicle for a long period of time in the bay to try to get it to operating temperature, especially it being a hybrid may take a while, or you'd have to set something on the gas pedal or set the AC on high for it to continuously run the engine. This is going to cut some of that time in half and ensure that there is no air bubbles and we don't have any situation where we overheat or anything like that. This also allows me to shut the air off and monitor the gauge. Monitoring the gauge, you can ensure that there is no leaks in the system. The system isn't losing vacuum, meaning that it's 100% sealed. The hybrids, what we have to do is actually turn the AC on high. On this particular one, you can see she's running now. Nice and quiet, nice and smooth. We got to clean up a little bit of mess, but she's good to go. We're going to take it for a test ride. There's no longer any noise. We'll check for some leaks, and she should be good to go.